The air in the courtroom crackled, thick with unspoken tension. A hush fell as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a beacon of calm in a sea of legal maneuvering, stepped onto the witness stand. She was there to defend a young teacher wrongly accused. What unfolded next wasn't just a defense. It was a dramatic collision of power and truth, a moment where a judge's arrogance met a congresswoman's unwavering resolve, culminating in an arrest that stunned everyone present. This is the story of what happens when the scales of justice, long tipped, finally begin to balance. When Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett calmly took the stand to defend a wrongfully accused teacher, she didn't expect the judge to insult her on record, nor did he expect to be arrested minutes later in front of everyone. There's a certain tension that lingers in courthouses, silent, heavy, the kind you feel before a storm hits. That morning in Shreveport, Louisiana, the atmosphere inside the Caddo Parish Courthouse was different, though tighter, unspoken but visible. People straightened in their seats. Phones were silenced without reminders. Something was coming, and most didn't know what. Representative Jasmine Crockett walked through the heavy wooden doors, wearing a navy blue suit, hair pinned back, no entourage. She wasn't there to campaign or pose for cameras. She was there because someone she believed in, a young teacher named Troy Ellison, needed her. Troy had been falsely accused of assaulting a police officer during a protest. Jasmine had known him for years. He ran a tutoring center out of a church basement, spent Saturdays handing out food to seniors. She believed in his character so strongly, she agreed to testify on his behalf. The courtroom was already packed when she arrived. Lawyers whispered, reporters scribbled. Two high school girls sat in the back row, wide-eyed. Jasmine gave them a nod, more out of habit than anything. She was used to people watching, but this wasn't Congress. This was a courtroom, and it belonged to Judge Ronald Keaton. Now, Keaton had a reputation not for fairness, not for brilliance, for control. He'd been a judge for 22 years, long enough to believe the bench belonged to him. Rumor had it he'd once thrown out an entire defense because a lawyer rolled her eyes. Lawyers feared him, defendants dreaded him. And yet, despite complaints, there he was, still wearing the robe. He didn't look up when Jasmine entered. He just muttered something to his clerk and flipped through a file like she wasn't even there. That didn't bother her. She wasn't looking for a warm welcome. She took her seat in the front row, 3 seats down from Troy's mother, and waited. When her name was called, Jasmine stood with calm precision and walked to the witness stand. She was sworn in. The courtroom fell silent. Even the air seemed to pause. She began by explaining how she knew Troy, her history in civil rights law, her time in the Texas House before moving to Congress. It was clear, articulate, respectful. And then Judge Keaton cleared his throat. He didn't ask a question. He didn't raise an objection. He just said, "Miss Crockett, I hope you're not confusing this courtroom with a campaign stage. We're not here for speeches or fashion statements." There were soft murmurs. Jasmine blinked, surprised, but she didn't flinch. "I wasn't aware a simple introduction would be considered political, Your Honor," she replied, voice even. Keaton leaned back in his chair, smirked. "Your outfit is louder than your argument. You might be in Congress, but this isn't Capitol Hill. Let's try to keep the theatrics to a minimum." People in the gallery exchanged glances. One juror raised an eyebrow. A man in a gray suit in the far back row slowly shifted forward in his seat. His expression didn't change, but his eyes locked on the judge. Jasmine kept her composure. "I'm here to testify on behalf of a young man whose future is on the line. If you prefer I remain silent, I'll gladly step down." "No, get un wab dismissibly. By all means continue. Just don't forget where you are." It was subtle, but everyone saw it. The power play, the patronizing tone, the quiet attempt to humiliate her. And still, she held her ground, not a tremble in her voice, not a crack in her expression. She simply continued, finishing her statement with poise and clarity. The judge stared at her when she finished. "No, thank you. No, you may step down, just silence." And from the back row, the man in the gray suit gave the tiniest of nods. But what started as petty remarks quickly crossed the line. No one expected the moment Jasmine finished speaking. You could feel the courtroom holding its breath. No one dared move, not Troy, not his attorney, not the court clerk, who looked down at her screen like she wanted to disappear. Judge Keaton didn't say anything at first. He just flipped through the folder in front of him, as if he hadn't just tried to publicly put a sitting congresswoman in her place. Then, without looking up, he mumbled, "Well, it's not the most compelling testimony I've heard. Not sure what any of that has to do with the facts." Jasmine didn't react, but the jab didn't stop there. Keaton closed the folder and looked her dead in the eye. "Remind me, Miss Crockett, what exactly qualifies you to speak on behalf of this defendant? A law degree? A few speeches on television? Or is it simply because you two share background similarities?" There was not even thinly veiled. He didn't need to say anything more. Everyone in that room heard it for what it was. Troy's lawyer, a young man named Elliot Chambers, immediately stood up. "Your Honor, I must object to the tone." "Sit down," Keaton snapped. "You'll get your turn, counselor." Jasmine stayed seated. Her hands were folded, her breathing steady, but her eyes were locked on Keaton with something close to ice. "With all due respect," she said clearly, "my qualifications are not in question. I was asked to speak to Mr. Ellison's character. I did so. If the court isn't interested in honest testimony, then I'll gladly excuse myself." "Oh, please," Keaton barked. "Save the righteous act. You people always want to make yourselves the victim. I didn't attack you. I questioned your relevance. You're just not used to someone saying it to your face." That line landed like a slap. A sharp collective inhale filled the room. People looked around, unsure whether to speak, to stand, to scream. The two girls in the back row, barely high school age, looked stunned. Troy's mother covered her mouth with her hands. Even Troy, whose life was literally hanging in the balance, turned toward the judge in disbelief. But the man in the gray suit didn't flinch. He was already moving, subtle, quiet. His hand went into his coat, where a small black wallet emerged, a badge tucked quickly under his palm. Jasmine stood. "I don't need to be disrespected to prove my credibility, Your Honor. If this court wishes to treat elected officials this way, I shudder to think how it treats everyday citizens who don't have a platform." "You don't scare me with your titles, Miss Crockett," Keaton replied, "and frankly, I'm growing tired of your voice." Chambers stood again. "Objection. This is inappropriate. This isn't even cross-examination." "Overruled," Keaton snapped, turning his attention back to Jasmine. "You may step down. We've heard enough." Jasmine didn't say another word. She stepped down from the stand, but not before glancing at Troy. She gave him the smallest nod, quiet support, nothing performative. She walked past the gallery, past the man in the gray suit, whose eyes briefly met hers. She didn't know who he was, not yet, but there was something in his face, something deliberate. Keaton began shuffling papers again, clearly trying to move on. "Let's proceed. Next witness, please." But before anyone could rise, the courtroom doors opened behind them. Two men walked in, navy blue suits, clean-shaven, serious expressions. U.S. Marshals. The bailiff looked confused. Keaton frowned. "Can I help you?" The taller marshal held out a folded document. "We have a warrant for the arrest of Judge Ronald Keaton. Please step away from the bench." Everything stopped. Even the air felt heavier. Keaton stared at them, confused. "Excuse me." The shorter marshal stepped closer. "Step away from the bench, sir, now." But that man wasn't just an observer. He had been waiting for this exact moment. Judge Keaton didn't move. He blinked, like he hadn't heard them right. You could see the flicker of confusion turn into something else, pride maybe, or the remnants of power he thought he still had. "Is this a joke?" he asked, his voice sharp. "You don't storm into my courtroom and bark orders like I'm a street criminal." The tall marshal remained calm. "This is a federal order. Step away from the bench, Judge." Still seated, Keaton glanced at his clerk, then at the bailiff, as if expecting someone to step in on his behalf. No one did. "On what grounds?" he finally asked, voice rising. "You come in here without a phone call, without protocol." The marshal unfolded the document. "Ronald Charles Keaton, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice. accepting bribes, witness tampering, and misconduct in public office. Gasps echoed across the courtroom. And while most eyes were on the judge, mouth slightly open, red creeping up his neck, the man in the gray suit leaned back in his seat, satisfied. Because for him, this wasn't just a dramatic moment. It was the result of 2 years' worth of quiet investigation, most of it done in silence, frustration, and doubt. His name was Leon Draper. He worked for the Office of the Inspector General, formerly with the FBI. He'd spent years chasing financial corruption, and Keaton's name had landed on his desk after 3 anonymous letters came in from different attorneys, all accusing the judge of taking payments from a local developer to influence property disputes. It was hard to prove. Most corruption cases are. But the pattern was too blatant to ignore. Same developer, same law firm, same outcomes. One side always won. Keaton's rulings almost never aligned with state precedent, and no one dared challenge him. People were scared of his reach, of his power. He could ruin careers with a few sharp words. Leon started small. He requested court transcripts, dug through property records, interviewed former clerks who hesitated to talk until they were assured their names wouldn't appear in the report. What he found was a string of manipulated cases, edited transcripts, and unusually close ties between Keaton and a man named Vincent Burney, a political donor with a long track record of shady real estate deals. There was also a retired court reporter who, after a few months of silence, finally handed over an audio recording she wasn't supposed to keep. On it, Keaton could be heard joking, "Burney doesn't need a lawyer when he's got me." That was the break Leon needed. He filed a sealed indictment request. It was approved a month later. But the DOJ had been hesitant to move until today, until Keaton couldn't help himself and attacked a sitting U.S. representative in public. The outburst wasn't just disrespectful, it was reckless. And for Leon, it was all the confirmation he needed. A man that arrogant, that confident no one could touch him, was dangerous. So they moved. And now, Keaton stood frozen, surrounded by marshals, a courtroom watching him like a failed magician caught palming a coin. The robe didn't protect him anymore. "I want to speak to my attorney," he snapped. "You'll get that opportunity," the marshal said. "Please step down, or we will remove you." Keaton looked like he wanted to fight it. Maybe he would have tried, but his hands trembled slightly, not enough for most to see, but Leon saw it. Power bleeding out of a man who built his life on intimidation. Keaton stepped down as the marshals cuffed him right there in the courtroom he'd once ruled with an iron fist. The silence felt louder than any verdict. People didn't cheer, but didn't need to. The image spoke for itself. Jasmine, still seated near the front, didn't move. She just stared ahead, lips pressed together, eyes unreadable. But no one expected justice to arrive right in the middle of a live court session. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed louder than anyone expected. It was the sound of power being stripped away, of a man who'd spent decades commanding attention suddenly at the mercy of his own courtroom. Judge Keaton didn't look at anyone as they walked him down the narrow aisle. His eyes locked straight ahead, jaw clenched. His robe flapped slightly as one of the marshals guided him toward the exit. Someone in the gallery whispered something, but no one laughed. The room had gone from tense to stunned, like the air itself had thickened. A woman sitting 2 rows behind Jasmine let out a single breath. Finally, she muttered, not loud, but audible. Troy's lawyer, Elliot Chambers, didn't hide his shock. His hands were still resting on the table, fingers half curled around pen. "Is this real?" he asked, almost to himself. Jasmine slowly turned her head and watched Keaton's figure shrink as he was let out through the double doors. Her expression didn't change, but inside her thoughts were racing. She wasn't the kind of person who took pleasure in someone else's downfall, but this felt different. It wasn't vengeance. It was something closer to balance. Outside the courtroom, the hallway was already filling with murmurs. Reporters who hadn't even been assigned to the trial were rushing in, alerted by texts and buzzed phones. Within minutes, a news camera crew was setting up just outside the building. One of them recognized Jasmine as she stepped out. "Congresswoman Crockett, can we get a statement?" She paused, but didn't stop walking. I came here today to speak for a young man whose life was being misrepresented, she said, her voice clear but measured. What happened inside that courtroom is not about me. It's about what happens when people believe their title puts them above accountability. The reporter tried to follow up, but she raised a hand and kept moving, escorted by a courthouse staffer who looked like he just walked out of a thunderstorm. Inside the courtroom, no one really knew what to do next. The bailiff looked uncertain. Chambers leaned over to Troy and whispered, "Just sit tight. This changes a lot." Troy leaned back slowly. "Is my case even going to continue?" "Hard to say," Chambers replied. "They'll probably bring in a new judge. Might take a few days, but this could help a lot." Leon Draper remained in his seat for a while longer, arms crossed, observing the ripple in the room. He'd seen reactions like this before, but never with so many moving parts. Elected official, civil rights case, corrupt judge. He knew the cameras would spin it in every direction. Some would cry victory, others would scream conspiracy. But the facts were clean and the evidence airtight. Still, Leon wasn't celebrating. He never did after an arrest. He knew this was only the beginning. The hard part came next. Ensuring charges stuck, getting more witnesses to come forward, and dealing with the politics that always followed high-profile takedowns. But there was one moment, just one, that stuck with him more than anything else. As he finally stood to leave, he passed Jasmine in the hallway. She had just ended a phone call and was standing by a pillar near the entrance. Their eyes met. Leon gave a respectful nod. "Thank you for holding your ground," he said. Jasmine gave a small smile, one corner of her mouth lifting. "I wasn't going to let him shame me in my own country." Leon didn't respond right away. He just studied her face for a moment. You didn't know at the time, but that moment, that's what sealed the case. The way he spoke to you, we were watching. She raised her eyebrows. "You were waiting for him to mess up?" "No," he corrected. "We knew he already had. We were waiting for him to do it in front of people who could no longer look away." But this story didn't end with handcuffs. It got even messier. Behind the scenes, by the time evening rolled in, the footage had already gone viral. Clips of Judge Keaton being escorted out of his own courtroom, handcuffed, circulated across every platform: Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, even local evening news. Some videos focused on Jasmine's unwavering expression. Others zoomed in on Keaton's confused stare, like he still couldn't believe what was happening. Cable news shows called in legal experts. Commentators debated the implications. In some corners of the internet, people applauded the moment as a turning point. In others, the usual cynics shouted "setup" or "witch hunt." But no matter what side people fell on, one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a courtroom anymore. This was about power being challenged in real time. By the following morning, Keaton's name had been temporarily removed from the docket. The Judicial Conduct Board issued a public statement saying it had opened an internal investigation, but internal wasn't enough. The Department of Justice confirmed the indictment was unsealed. The charges were read on national television: bribery, abuse of authority, obstruction of justice. It was the kind of list that made people lean in closer, wondering how long it had gone on and how many had looked the other way. Former defendants began coming forward. A woman from Lafayette named Deidre Pace did an interview on a local station, describing how Keaton had laughed during her eviction case, even when she broke down in tears about losing her kids' home. Another man posted a handwritten letter on Facebook claiming Keaton had refused to hear evidence that would have cleared his name. And these weren't isolated stories. They were dots on a map that, when connected, painted a dark picture. Jasmine tried to keep her head down after the arrest, but that wasn't easy. Her office was flooded with calls, some thanking her, others accusing her of grandstanding. She didn't respond to the noise. Instead, she kept her schedule. She returned to D.C. 2 days later and delivered a quiet but firm address on the House floor. No theatrics, no anger, just facts. There are judges across this country doing their jobs with fairness, integrity, and humility, she said. But one man wearing a robe doesn't make the system just. Accountability is not disrespect. It's necessary. Her words struck a nerve. Other lawmakers took notice. A few even began pushing for stricter oversight of local courts. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a start. As for Troy Ellison, His case was reassigned to a new judge from Baton Rouge, and when the trial resumed a week later, the tone couldn't have been more different. Calm, measured, respectful. Troy's attorney laid out the facts without interruption, and the prosecution, suddenly missing the confidence it once had, struggled to maintain their footing. Jasmine didn't testify again. She didn't need to. On the third day, the judge dismissed the case for lack of evidence. Troy walked out a free man. His mother cried the second they stepped outside the courthouse, not the loud kind, just steady tears sliding down her cheeks as Troy hugged her with both arms. Jasmine wasn't there in person, but she got a photo in her inbox later that evening. Troy standing with a group of kids outside his tutoring center, holding up a sign that read, "Still teaching, still fighting back." Back in Shreveport, the courthouse was quieter than usual. The seat behind the bench where Keaton once sat remained empty, a folded black cloth placed over it until a replacement could be confirmed. People still whispered about what happened. Some said they never liked Keaton anyway. Others claimed they'd always known something was off. But for the first time in a long while, it felt like people were watching each other a little closer. The illusion of immunity had cracked. But beyond the headlines, there was something deeper. Long after the headlines faded and the trial footage was replaced by newer controversies, something about that day stuck with people. It wasn't just the drama of a judge in handcuffs or the shock on his face. It was the moment someone who had every reason to shrink back stood tall instead and didn't waver. For Jasmine, that courtroom wasn't the first time someone tried to belittle her. She'd faced it growing up in Texarkana, when teachers talked over her answers in class or called her too opinionated for a girl. Later, in law school, there were professors who smirked when she asked pointed questions. On the campaign trail, she heard it all. Angry, loud, not polished enough. Every version of sit down dressed up in different words. But she never sat down. That day in court, Keaton hadn't just been rude. He had tried to humiliate her in front of a packed room, to diminish her, reduce her to nothing but a stereotype. In his mind, he used his bench as a stage and expected her to bow. And when she didn't, when she held her gaze and spoke back without flinching, he lost control. That wasn't about her clothing or her tone. It was about the one thing men like him fear most, someone who isn't afraid to speak when silence is expected. And that's what made everything unravel. Leon Draper said it best later in a radio interview, when asked why the arrest happened in the courtroom and not behind closed doors. Because corruption happens in private, but accountability should be public. Jasmine listened to that clip on the train ride back to D.C. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened just a little. She'd been called a lot of things in her career, but victim was never one she wore. Still, she knew this wasn't just about her. It never had been. It was about the clerk who stayed late to fix court transcript she knew were wrong, but couldn't say anything. It was about the young attorney who bit her tongue when Keaton yelled during her first trial. It was about the defendants who came into that courtroom already believing they didn't stand a chance. For all of them, that day was a crack in the system, a moment that proved arrogance eventually gets outpaced by truth if someone is willing to call it out. Troy went back to his students. Chambers took on 2 new civil rights cases, newly energized. And Jasmine kept working, showing up to hearings, meetings, and town halls, like she always had, but now with one more reminder tucked into her memory. The cost of standing tall and why it's worth it. In an interview a few weeks later, a local journalist asked her what she hoped people remembered about the trial. She paused, then answered plainly, "Don't let anyone make you small for telling the truth, especially not someone who thinks they're untouchable." That quote made its rounds too, printed on protest signs, shared in classrooms, passed between generations who needed to hear it. Because sometimes the lesson isn't about what happened. It's about who stayed grounded when everything else tried to knock them over. And in the end, Jasmine didn't win anything tangible that day. She wasn't given a trophy. No awards ceremony followed. But something shifted in that courtroom, in that city, maybe even across the country. A reminder that character still matters, that power without respect eventually eats itself alive. But what she didn't know yet was how far her actions that day would reach. 2 months later, the courtroom looked almost the same. Same wooden benches, same scuffed floors, same worn-out cushions on the jury chairs. But the seat behind the bench was now filled by someone new. Judge Leonora Hines, appointed temporarily by the state until a permanent replacement could be confirmed. She had a quiet way about her, calm, sharp, but unassuming, the type of judge who didn't need to raise her voice to get people to listen. Troy stopped by the courthouse that day, not for a hearing, just to see it from a different angle, from the other side of fear. He sat in the back row, hands in his lap, remembering every second of that trial. How small he'd felt when Keaton walked in, how hard it was to believe anything could go his way, and then how fast everything changed, not with violence, not with chaos, but with truth spoken aloud. Outside, the city had gone back to its usual rhythm. Traffic, school buses, coffee shops with chipped mugs. But in small pockets, community centers, barber shops, college classrooms, people still talked about what happened, not like gossip, but like a warning, like a lesson. Leon Draper had returned to D.C. as well, quietly, without fanfare. His report had been completed, and Keaton's case was now in the hands of a federal prosecutor. More charges had been added after forensic accountants found proof of shell companies and off-the-books transfers. There was even talk of racketeering. But Leon wasn't chasing headlines. He moved on to the next case, the next name buried beneath red tape. Still, he carried Jasmine's testimony on a flash drive in his briefcase. His reminder that even when the system bends, someone willing to speak with clarity can force it back into shape. As for Jasmine, she didn't mention Keaton in interviews anymore. Not because she was trying to forget, but because she knew the story had become bigger than him. It was no longer about a judge or a trial. It was about courage, not loud, chest-thumping courage, but the quiet kind, the kind that holds its voice steady even while being dismissed, mocked, or insulted in public. She kept doing her work, sponsoring bills, showing up to committee meetings, listening. She knew that some people still saw her as the one who got the judge arrested, and maybe that would follow her for years. But she also knew that reputation didn't come from one moment. It came from consistency, from choosing again and again to do what was right, even when it was easier to let things slide. Troy's tutoring program doubled in size. More parents signed their kids up. Volunteers started showing up without being asked. And when a local journalist asked him what changed, Troy didn't talk about Keaton. He said, "It changed when someone stood up for me, when it wasn't easy to. Sometimes that's all it takes. One person refusing to shrink, one voice holding the line, one witness who doesn't play along. Because silence protects the powerful, and truth, it only works if someone's willing to speak it, even when it shakes the room." Let this be a reminder. When someone tries to make you feel smaller, it says more about them than it ever will about you. Power doesn't make you right, and a title doesn't make you untouchable. Stand your ground. Speak your truth, even if your voice shakes. If you found this story powerful, share it. Tell someone about Jasmine, about Troy, about what happened in that courtroom. Because stories like this don't just reveal problems. They remind us what it looks like when someone chooses courage anyway. Lessons learned. The courtroom in Shreveport became an unexpected stage for profound lessons. It showed that even seemingly insurmountable power can be challenged when truth finds a voice willing to speak it. Jasmine Crockett's unwavering stance in the face of disrespect highlighted the importance of holding one's ground, not for personal gain, but for the sake of justice and the voiceless. Troy's liberation underscored the impact of an ally who refuses to be intimidated. And the quiet work of people like Leon Draper reminds us that systemic change often begins with unseen dedication. Ultimately, this story echoes a timeless truth. Courage, even in its quietest form, can be the most potent force against injustice. And the courage to speak truth to power can ripple outwards, offering hope and inspiring others to do the same.